The introduction of contraception in the late 50s and no-fault divorce laws in the 60s completely reshaped family structures. Particularly, the rates of premarital sex and marital dissolution dramatically increased, while the rates of union formation declined, all this owing to permissive sexual attitudes. No-fault divorce laws increased the rate of filing for divorce and the percentage of women who file. The fact that women benefit from no-fault divorce laws by taking advantage of easier exits from marriage implies that the return to a fault-based system will derail the so-called women empowerment. Some of the outcomes of facilitating divorce included increased rates and increased poverty in single-parent homes mostly headed by women. Particularly, the rate of divorce rose from 2.2 per 1,000 in 1960 to 5.2 per 1,000 in 1980, which a signified 136% increase. 16% of first marriages failed in 1960, with this rate being 50% in 1997. The rate of divorce went up by 40% 5 years after the implementation of no-fault divorce laws. Annually reported divorces were 400,000 in the 60s, with this number being 1 million by 1975. Similarly, out-of-wedlock births went from 5% in 1960 to 31% in 1993. The fact that women lose while men gain financially following divorce informs the assumption that men file for divorce at rates higher than those of women. The reasoning in this case revolves around husbands taking advantage of no-fault divorce laws to keep disproportionate sizes of the marital property. By almost every measure, the average divorced woman's standards of living declines after the termination of a marriage, with the average being lower than the husband's. Women also face extended terms of low wealth and consumption after divorce based on the fact that they are less likely to remarry. This phenomenon is associated with the fact that a woman's value declines in the marriage market, while the man's increases. Newly divorced women experience serious difficulties attending to their parenting roles, with this difficulty manifesting in weaknesses in consistency and the ability to cope with the stress arising from single parenting. However, women are the instigators of separation as presented in this table, despite the perceived deep attachment to children and the evidence of how divorces affect children. Some of the effects of divorce on children are clearly documented. Children of divorce are twice as likely to be expelled from school, more likely to perform poorly in school, 2 to 3 times more likely to develop behavioral problems, more likely to commit suicide with the number being 3 out of every 4, and more likely to report depression. Women not only file for divorce more, they also instigate separation in marriages and unions in general. The rate of wife-filed divorces ranged from 60% for the better part of the 19th century to more than 70%. Women filing for divorce almost 2/3 of the time is commonly explained as women filing for tradition, women filing to assure their innocence or uphold the victim's status in the divorce proceedings, women filing to secure custody and support, or women filing just for convenience. A silver lining is the fact that divorced women report being happier when divorced than when married. Overall, the fact that women file for divorce despite the clearly documented costs raises some eyebrows and is worth some examination. The variations in the rates at which men and women file for divorce explain the gender differences in marriage. The rise of divorce rates resulted in the division of unions into his and her marriage. Men and women not only differ in the perceptions of marital organization, but they also gain differently in marriage, with either perceiving the other to be benefiting more. Gender differences in who gains more in the marriage have been central to discussions surrounding the rise of divorce rates over the recent past. Some have argued that the newly found female autonomy has been central to increasing divorce rates because whatever was restricted to marriage is now available outside. Such is the case with sexual permissiveness, especially following the invention of the pill in the late 50s, which saw a significant rise in premarital sex and single-parent homes as a consequence. The dramatic change surrounding premarital sex attitudes gave rise to the phrase, "Why buy the cow when the milk is being offered for free?" which attempts to explain why people, especially men, are not forming unions anymore. Most literature on divorce has largely focused on social and economic determinants. Some of the most common determinants in these categories include whether children are involved or not, the age of marriage, female employment, and male unemployment. The plain examination of these variables results in a shallow understanding of divorce risks since most of the factors have a theoretical underpinning. For instance, The positive relationship between female employment and divorce could be founded on specialization considerations, the wife's economic independence, and the husband's disapproval of a working wife. Thus, the effect of both male and female employment is of important consideration when discussing divorce rates. Employment as a standalone variable says little about the causes of divorce. The perceived benefits of either being married or not significantly influence the risks of divorce. The perceived relative benefits of marriage, which is the balance between the benefits of being married and staying out of marriage, determine whether people stay married or not. The several combinations arising from these benefit-related perceptions include both parties having negative perceptions or one party having a negative perception while the other has a positive one. The person with the negative perception is more likely to initiate the divorce process. However, it is not as simplistic as it sounds. Noteworthy, people have a tendency to protect their esteem, and as such, if one party unilaterally files for divorce, a phenomenon supported by no-fault divorce laws, the other is likely to go along with it because of their self-esteem. The need to protect one's ego facilitates the adoption of behaviors that enable coping with divorce. Besides, the general consideration of divorce as failure results in the manifestation of self-serving biases where individuals do not want to be blamed for the failure. Thus, a spouse might let their partner do the initiation of divorce, even though they also wanted it. The self-esteem bias massages one's ego, while self-serving bias does the exact opposite. The contribution of wife employment on divorce has clearly been documented in numerous studies. A large share of the reasoning behind this relationship is founded on economic and cultural arguments. The cultural arguments surrounding wife employment and divorce revolve around traditional gender roles, with the husband being the breadwinner and the wife being the homemaker. Thus, husbands in cultures where the wife did not work traditionally have difficulties accommodating working wives, especially if their employment cannot be perceived as temporary or secondary to the household, because their identities as providers are seriously threatened. Therefore, wife employment should be associated with increased likelihood of men filing for divorce, but that's not the case. The economic argument is grounded on the foundations of the financial stress theory, which suggests that financial instability contributes to divorce because economic worries raise the prevalence and severity of marital conflicts. Financial difficulties strain the marriage economically, with the most notable consequence being disrupted harmony. The decline in harmony manifests in increased marital conflict, lower marital satisfaction, and the increased risk of divorce. Purely based on the financial stress theory, money is an important factor in marriage. Poor familial financial positions threaten the husband's breadwinning identity. Just as the husband may disapprove the employed wife, so does the wife disapprove the unemployed husband. Women are more sensitive to the problems faced in a marriage, which would explain why wife disapproval of an unemployed husband could be more likely to contribute to divorce, since it is a more acceptable premise compared to divorce because the wife is working, which is often labeled as backwardness, fearing empowered women, misogyny, or men being controlling. But a woman disapproving an unemployed husband, and even filing for divorce on the basis of male unemployment, is often labeled as her knowing her value. The theory of comparative advantage suggests that the full benefits of marriage are achieved with role specialization. The theory maintains that partner specialization in paid and unpaid labor raises the total utility of marriage. The theory of comparative advantage borrows from the differences in raising boys and girls, which then determines the roles assumed by men and women in unions. Assuming different roles allows individuals to work effectively, thereby raising the overall utility in a marriage. Men with relatively high earnings potential gain more from marriage than men with relatively low earnings potential, not only because of the higher level of their income but also because of greater gains from specialization within marriage, since their mates have a comparative advantage in specializing in non-market investments. The economic specialization theory has underpinnings similar to those of the theory of comparative advantage in suggesting that the economic arrangements of a marriage, including unemployed husband and breadwinning wife, destabilize marriage by minimizing the utilities or incentives of staying married. The economic transformation that is female employment became a threat to unions around 1989, 2 decades after the introduction of no-fault divorce laws, when women started leaving unions since they were no longer dependent on the union, at least financially. Unemployed women and women on parental leaves are less likely to leave unhappy unions compared to those who are working. Some authors argue that the overfocus on how women's employment contributes to divorce excuses men's lack of participation in unpaid labor. Increased uncertainties in the workforce, the rise in divorce risks, and the transitions between male and female behavior have minimized the benefits of trading and specialization and reduced men's ability to negotiate for traditional unions. Such arguments point towards the direction of women risking specialization to develop marriage-specific capital. Female employment has greatly reduced men's bargaining for traditional unions, with women negotiating for more egalitarian unions and leaving if they fail to get it. Female employment minimizes the gains arising from specialization-related efficiency. Male employment is associated with increased marital stability, while the opposite is true for female employment. Women with a strong presence in the labor market are faced with minimal financial risks when exiting unions, thereby making it easier to dissolve unsatisfactory unions. Participation in formal employment might not exactly reduce the financial costs associated with divorce, but it does change the perceptions. Particularly, employment strengthens women's beliefs in personal competence to run a household alone, which lowers the threshold to divorce. Thus, employment increases women's economic and psychological independence, which reduces the perceived costs of divorce. Overall, female employment contributes to divorce, with the underlying reasons being employment brings female independence, thereby reducing the gains of being married, may be disapproved by the husband because it takes away his breadwinning identity, and reduces the gains realized from specialization. Of all the reasons, most studies support the independence one, which could suggest that money, nowadays proxied as security, is the primary reason why a woman would get married, and once she has her own, she sees no reason to remain married. This phenomenon is further supported by the fact that financial difficulties in a marriage are more likely to push a woman than a man to file for divorce. The reason behind women filing for divorce following financial difficulties revolve around the male breadwinning role, despite all the changes that have happened over the recent past which have seen the female homemaking role fading over time. The fact that husbands are expected to provide implies that wives are more likely to blame financial difficulties on the husbands. Wives present greater sensitivity to financial strains in the marriage, which would explain why financial difficulties increase the rate at which women file for divorce. The sexual revolution brought about by the invention of contraception resulted in people delaying the age at which they marry and got married. It is generally expected that the longer someone has stayed in the market searching for a partner, the more quality they get, and as such, the less likelihood of divorce. Some of the indicators of match quality include the age of marriage, the time taken to know each other, and degree of homogamy. People who marry at a young age and those who marry after knowing each other for a short period present the greatest likelihood of divorce. As mentioned, women are more sensitive to marital problems compared to men, and as such, poor match quality raises the likelihood of women filing for divorce. Age difference also increases the likelihood of divorce, with large age gaps contributing to instability. This is the case in instances where the woman is much older compared to when the man is much older, with these setups becoming increasingly common because of women's placement in the labor market that has come with the entitlement to choice. Couples with children are less likely to divorce compared to those without, especially in the case of young children. In other words, children are often perceived, as well as presented, as marital capital that ties a couple together. The financial costs of divorce are higher for women, especially those with children. Following the introduction of no-fault divorce laws that increased the ease of divorce in California, the American government noted that divorce was the strongest predictor of poverty among women, especially those with children. The government resolved this phenomenon not by rolling back the no-fault divorce laws, but by setting up the child support system in 1975. However, men suffer greater social costs following divorce. Fathers rarely get custody of their children after divorce, and they see them even less. The presence of children overall reduces the likelihood of divorce since people stay together for the sake of the child. Preemptive filing in the case of the child ascertains that wife secures custody of the children and the resultant support. Wives file for support to establish custody over the children, leave the marriage with enhanced human capital as in the case of a partner paying for their education, or escape an exploitative partner. Getting children and support implies that divorced wives assume the control over a household, including supervising the ex-husband's visitations with the children. Wives escaping an exploitative partner have easier divorce processes and are more likely to receive alimony, which would explain the allegations of abuse in almost every divorce proceeding. Wives who seek to escape with the profits of marriage are better off after divorce at the expense of their partner. Whatever you do with that information is up to you. Appropriate custody rules would mitigate the use of divorce to gain control over children.